This lecture is going to talk all about the human respiratory system. What do you think is the function of our respiratory system? Why is it so important that we're talking about it? The respiratory system is a group of organs that work together to exchange oxygen with carbon dioxide. So essentially what our respiratory system is doing for us is exchanging a vital nutrient, oxygen, for a waste product, carbon dioxide, so that we can get the waste product out of our body and the nutrient into our body.
In order to stay alive, the body has to breathe air. We breathe in oxygen and we breathe out carbon dioxide. This process is known as respiration. Breathing happens automatically. Every day, the body breathes about 20,000 times. By the time we reach 70 years old, that's about 600 million breaths. All of this breathing occurs because of the respiratory system, which includes the nose, throat, voice box, windpipe, and lungs. At the top of the respiratory system, the nostrils bring air into the nose, where it's filtered, warmed, and moistened. Tiny hairs called cilia protect the nasal passageways and other parts of the respiratory tract and filter out dust and other particles that enter the nose through the breathed air. Air can also be breathed in through the mouth. The two airways of the nose and mouth meet up at the pharynx, which is located at the back of the throat. The pharynx carries both food and air and is used for digestion and respiration. One part is for food. This is called the esophagus, which leads on to the stomach. The other side is for air. It's called the trachea. A small flap of tissue, called the epiglottis, covers the air-only passage when we swallow. This stops food and liquid from going into the lungs. The larynx, or voice box, is located at the top of the trachea, the air-only pipe. This is where our vocal cords are. The trachea, or windpipe, which is a 2 to 3 centimetre tube, then extends downwards from the bottom of the larynx for about 12 centimetres. The walls of the windpipe are made strong by stiff rings of cartilage that keep it open. The trachea is also lined with tiny hairs. They sweep foreign particles and fluids out of the airway, keeping them from entering the lungs. The windpipe divides into 2 branches, and each one of these enters one of the 2 lungs of the body. Each branch resembles the limbs of a tree, dividing into smaller, finer branches called bronchioles. The bronchioles end in tiny air sacs called alveoli, which look a bit like grapes. These structures enable fresh air to get to the air sacs, which are surrounded by tiny blood vessels, or capillaries. The oxygen passes through these air sacs and travels through the capillary walls into the bloodstream. At the same time, carbon dioxide transfers from the bloodstream into the air sacs, where it gets breathed out of the body. When we exercise, the body needs more oxygen to feed the muscles as they work harder. The body responds by breathing more quickly and deeply. As the cells of the muscles use up more oxygen, the lungs have to work harder to keep up the supply. The respiratory system then speeds up to supply the body with much needed oxygen, and also to get rid of the carbon dioxide waste in the system. Over time, exercising also helps our chest cavity to get bigger, which enables the body to increase the amount of air it takes in. More capillaries form around the air sacs, so the body gets better at swapping oxygen and carbon dioxide gases. We can see how the body's respiratory system helps the body to move about, and is influenced by regular and ongoing physical activity as well.
So that's a brief introduction to the respiratory system. Let's talk about it in more detail. Alright, so the anatomy of the respiratory system. We have our nose, which we breathe in through, the nasal cavity that air travels through, and then down into the pharynx, the larynx, the trachea, and from the trachea, the air that we've breathed in through our nose then passes into the bronchus, and there's both a left and right bronchus, and then into the lungs, and you have both a left and right lung, and finally the diaphragm, which I'm going to tell you more about. This is the main anatomy of the respiratory system. So what is the major organ of the respiratory system? This should be obvious. It's your lungs. Alright, so let's talk about the different parts of the anatomy. The pharynx is located at the back of your mouth, and it serves as both a passageway for both air and food. This is why we choke, because when you swallow food, you actually are not taking in any air. You can either take in air or you can swallow food, but you can't do both at the same time. And if the food gets stuck, then your pharynx, air can't get through your pharynx. So what stops you when you swallow food? Air stops when you swallow food. Alright, after the pharynx is the trachea. It's also known as our windpipe, and it leads to the lungs. The purpose of the trachea is to filter out dust, dirt, and smoke so that the air that gets into our lungs is very clean. So, what is a tracheostomy and why is it performed? Tracheostomy is when the trachea becomes damaged, and that can either be through smoking or it can get crushed. And it's when a hole is inserted so that air can actually pass directly into the trachea, bypass the pharynx. The larynx is a structure that is made out of cartilage, which is the same material that makes up our nose, and it is at the top of the trachea, and it contains our vocal cords. So the reason why you're able to hear me now is because my larynx is working. The voice box is also called the Adam's apple. Typically, it's called the Adam's apple in men. The vocal cords, which you see down here, consist of two elastic folds of tissue that are in the larynx. As the air passes over that tissue, the tissue vibrates, and that's what produces the sound that we hear. So the bronchi, and that is plural because you have two, a left and a right, it's inside of your chest cavity. So the trachea, the structure that's made out of cartilage, it actually divides into two branches that kind of look like trees, and each of those branches is what enters the lungs. So as the air is traveling down the trachea, it then divides into the two branches and passes through the bronchi directly into the lungs. The lungs are the main organs of the respiratory system, and they are specialized for exchanging gases between the blood and the atmosphere. Do you remember what gases we talked about? Specifically, oxygen and carbon dioxide. So what process allows for gas exchange? We actually did a lab on this last semester. The process is known as diffusion. Oxygen diffuses through the capillaries and into the blood. Carbon dioxide diffuses out of the blood through the capillaries into the lungs, and then we breathe out carbon dioxide as a waste product. So here's a detailed explanation. So the bronchioles, they are one of the finest branches of the bronchial tubes, and they end in air sacs. So the trachea divides into two tubes that kind of look like trees because they have all these branches coming off of them, and those branches are what are known as bronchioles, and the bronchioles end in these air sacs. So you can see here, these are our lungs. These are branches of the bronchus, and these branches are called bronchioles, and at the end of the bronchioles are the alveoles, and the alveoles are filled with capillaries, and the capillaries are what are actually diffusing the gases. So you can see a close-up here. Again, the red is representing the oxygenated blood because when iron mixes with oxygen, it rusts, and the blue is representing deoxygenated blood. So what these alveoles are doing is exchanging carbon dioxide for oxygen so that our bodies get the nutrients and we can breathe out the waste products. And these alveoles, you can actually increase the amount of alveoles that are in your lungs through exercise. Research has shown that people who exercise regularly actually develop new alveoles. And if you develop enough new alveoles, you can actually increase the mass of your lungs. Pretty fascinating. So your chest size can actually expand with enough exercise. And by enough exercise, I mean a lot of exercise. So the alveoli are air sacs at the end of the bronchiole where gas exchange actually occurs, where process of diffusion actually occurs. Alright, so the mechanisms of breathing. We have all of the parts that we need for breathing, but how does breathing actually happen? Well, let's start with inhalation. Got to get that air into the body. So inhalation cannot happen without the diaphragm. And the diaphragm is a large flat muscle that's located along the bottom of your rib cage. And essentially that diaphragm is what separates the chest cavity from the abdominal cavity. During inhalation, the diaphragm contracts, moving down. As the chest cavity expands in size, the volume increases and the pressure decreases relative to the atmosphere outside of your body. So that muscle, the diaphragm, as it moves down, it's creating empty space in the chest cavity that wasn't there before. So it's creating more volume. As there's more volume, there's going to be less pressure because there's more room for all of the gases and organs to move around. So volume increases, pressure decreases. But what our bodies want to do is equalize that pressure, because if the pressure on the outside of our bodies is too great, it will actually could cause our chest to collapse. So what happens is that air rushes into our lungs, so our lungs expand and fill up that empty space. Inhalation is also called inspiration. So you see images over here, and you can see the diaphragm at the bottom of the rib cage. The rib cage is protecting these vital lungs. And you can actually see sort of an example of what's happening. If we were to put a balloon in a glass jar and place a piece of rubber over the top of the glass jar, we could force air into the balloon by pulling that piece of rubber down. So essentially the piece of rubber is acting as our diaphragm. So that's how we get air into our lungs. That's how we get oxygen into our lungs. How do we get carbon dioxide and air out of our lungs? Well, it's the opposite process. So during exhalation, our diaphragm relaxes, which means it moves back up into the chest cavity. As the diaphragm is moving up into the chest cavity, the volume of the chest cavity is decreasing, thus the pressure is increasing. So as the diaphragm moves up into the chest cavity, there's less room in the chest cavity, which means that there's a lot more pressure because stuff doesn't fit anymore. So in order to make it so that the lungs can fit comfortably in the chest cavity, what happens is that air is forced out of the lungs and you exhale. So again, it's about equalizing pressure. It's about maintaining homeostasis. Exhalation is also known as expiration. And in our example of the jar that has the rubber over the top, if the rubber is pushed back up into the jar, there's just simply less room in the jar. And in order to equalize, the air will rush out of the balloon, just as the air rushes out of our lungs. Alright, let's watch an animation.
The respiratory system moves air through the nose, pharynx, larynx, trachea, and bronchus to the alveoli where the gas exchange between oxygen and carbon dioxide occurs. Nares are the openings to the nose. The nasal cavity is lined with cilia, mucous membranes, and blood capillaries. The air is filtered by cilia, moistened by mucous membranes, and warmed by the blood. Air moves into the pharynx or throat, the common passageway for food and air. Air continues on to the larynx. The epiglottis, the flap of tissue in front of the larynx, closes off the larynx when swallowing to prevent food from entering. The larynx or voice box contains the vocal folds. The trachea or windpipe connects the larynx to the bronchial tree. The cartilage rings of the trachea prevent the trachea from collapsing. Lungs are spongy tissue with alveoli and blood capillaries. Breathing occurs because of the expansion and contraction of the lungs. The bronchi carrying the air subdivide into smaller branches called bronchioles. At the end of each bronchiole are the alveolar sacs. The alveolar sacs are surrounded by blood capillaries and contain millions of single-layer alveoli cells where the gas exchange takes place. Oxygenated air goes from the nose to the pharynx, larynx, trachea, bronchus, and alveoli. By the process of diffusion, oxygen in the air moves from the alveoli to the capillaries. Carbon dioxide moves from the capillaries to the alveoli and is exhaled. This process is called respiration.
So why would you do this to your lungs? Love your lungs and love your mouth.
So that is the respiratory system, the main parts of the respiratory system, how the respiratory system functions. Make sure you can explain inhalation and exhalation.